Chapter 2 of The Angel of the Revolution by George Griffith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2 At War with Society. When Richard Arnold reached the embankment, dusk had deepened into night, so far at least as nature was concerned. But in London, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was but little night to speak of, save in the sense of a division of time. The date of the paper which contained the account of the tragedy on the Russian railway was September the 3rd, 1903, and within the last 10 years enormous progress had been made in electric lighting. The ebb and flow in the Thames had at last been turned to account, and worked huge turbines which perpetually stored up electric power that was used not only for lighting, but for cooking in hotels and private houses, and for driving machinery. At all the great centres of traffic, huge electric suns cast their rays far and wide along the streets, supplementing the light of the lesser lamps with which they were lined on each side. The embankment from Westminster to Blackfriars was bathed in a flood of soft white light from hundreds of great lamps running along both sides, and from the centre of each bridge a million candle-power sun cast rays upon the water that were continued in one unbroken stream of light from Chelsea to the Tower. On the north side of the river the scene was one of brilliant and splendid opulence that contrasted strongly with the half-lighted gloom of the murky wilderness of South London, dark and forbidding in its irredeemable ugliness. From Blackfriars Arnold walked briskly towards Westminster, bitterly contrasting as he went the lavish display of wealth around him with the sordid and seemingly hopeless poverty of his own desperate condition. He was the maker and possessor of a far greater marvel than anything that helped to make up this splendid scene, and yet the ragged tramps, who were remorselessly moved on from one seat to another by the policemen as soon as they had settled themselves down for a rest and a doze, were hardly poorer than he was. For nearly 4 hours he paced backwards and forwards, every now and then stopping to lean on the parapet, and once or twice to sit down, until the chill autumn wind pierced his scanty clothing and compelled him to resume his walk in order to get warm again. All the time he turned his miserable situation over and over again in his mind, without avail. There seemed no way out of it, no way of obtaining the few pounds that would save him from homeless beggary, and his splendid invention from being lost to him and the world, certainly for years, and perhaps forever. And then, as hour after hour went by, and still no cheering thought came, the misery of the present pressed closer and closer upon him. He dare not go home, for that would be to bring the inevitable disaster of the morrow nearer, and, besides, it was home no longer till the rent was paid. He had 2 shillings, and he owed at least 12. He was also the maker of a machine for which the Tsar of Russia had made a standing offer of £1,000,000 sterling. That million might have been his if he had possessed the money necessary to bring his invention under the notice of the great autocrat. That was the position he had turned over and over in his mind, until its horrible contradictions maddened him. With a little money, riches and fame were his. Without it, he was a beggar in sight of starvation. And yet he doubted whether, even in his present dire extremity, he could, had he had the chance, sell what might be made the most terrific engine of destruction ever thought of, to the head and front of a despotism that he looked upon as the worst earthly enemy of mankind. For the 20th time he had paused in his weary walk to and fro to lean on the parapet close by Cleopatra's Needle. The embankment was almost deserted now, save by the tramps and a few isolated wanderers like himself. For several minutes he looked out over the brightly glittering waters below him, wondering listlessly how long it would take him to drown if he dropped over, and whether he would be rescued before he was dead, and brought back to life, and prosecuted the next day for daring to try and leave the world, save in the conventional and orthodox fashion. Then his mind wandered back to the Tsar and his million, and he pictured to himself the awful part that a fleet of airships such as his would play in the general European war that people said could not now be put off for many months longer. As he thought of this, the vision grew in distinctness, and he saw them hovering over armies and cities and fortresses, and raining irresistible death and destruction down upon them. The prospect appalled him, and he shuddered as he thought that it was now really within the possibility of realization. And then his ideas began to translate themselves involuntarily into words which he spoke aloud, completely oblivious for the time being of his surroundings. "No, I think I would rather destroy it, and then take my secret with me out of the world, than put such an awful power of destruction and slaughter into the hands of the Tsar, or for that matter, any other of the rulers of the earth. Their subjects can butcher each other quite efficiently enough as it is. The next war will be the most frightful carnival of destruction that the world has ever seen. But what would it be like if I were to give one of the nations of Europe the power of raining death and desolation on its enemies from the skies? No, such a power, if used at all, should only be used against, and not for, the despotisms that afflict the earth with the curse of war." "Then why not use it so, my friend, if you possess it, and would see mankind freed from its tyrants?" said a quiet voice at his elbow. The sound instantly scattered his vision to the winds, and he turned round with a startled exclamation to see who had spoken. As he did so, a whiff of smoke from a very good cigar drifted past his nostrils, and the voice again said in the same quiet, even tones, "You must forgive me for my bad manners in listening to what you were saying, and also for breaking in upon your reverie. My excuse must be the great interest that your words had for me. Your opinions would appear to be exactly my own too, and perhaps you will accept that as another excuse for my rudeness." It was the first really kindly, friendly voice that Richard Arnold had heard for many a long day, and the words were so well chosen and so politely uttered that it was impossible to feel any resentment. So he simply said in answer, "There was no rudeness, sir, and besides, why should a gentleman like you apologise for speaking to another gentleman?" quickly interrupted his new acquaintance. "Because I transgressed the laws of politeness in doing so, and an apology was due. Your speech tells me that we are socially equals. Intellectually, you look my superior. The rest is a difference only of money, and that any smart swindler can bury himself in nowadays if he chooses. But come, if you have no objection to make my better acquaintance, I have a great desire to make yours. If you will pardon my saying so, you are evidently not an ordinary man, or else something tells me you would be rich. Have a smoke and let us talk, since we apparently have a subject in common. Which way are you going?" "Nowhere, and therefore anywhere," replied Arnold, with a laugh that had but little merriment in it. "I have reached a point from which all roads are one to me." "That being the case, I propose that you shall take the one that leads to my chambers in Savoy Mansions yonder. We shall find a bit of supper ready, I expect, and then I shall ask you to talk. Come along." There was no more mistaking the genuine kindness and sincerity of the invitation than the delicacy with which it was given. To have refused would not only have been churlish, but it would have been for a drowning man to knock aside a kindly hand held out to help him. So Arnold accepted, and the two new, strangely met and strangely assorted friends walked away together in the direction of the Savoy. The suite of rooms occupied by Arnold's new acquaintance was the beau ideal of a wealthy bachelor's abode. Small, compact, cosy, and richly furnished, yet in the best taste withal. The rooms looked like an indoor paradise to him, after the bare squalor of the one room that had been his own home for over 2 years. His host took him first into a dainty little bathroom to wash his hands, and by the time he had performed his scanty toilet, supper was already on the table in the sitting room. Nothing melts reserve like a good, well-cooked meal washed down by appropriate liquids, and before supper was half over, Arnold and his host were chatting together as easily as though they stood on perfectly equal terms and had known each other for years. His new friend seemed purposely to keep the conversation to general subjects until the meal was over, and his pattern manservant had removed the cloth and left them together with the wine and cigars on the table. As soon as he had closed the door behind him, his host motioned Arnold to an easy chair on one side of the fireplace, threw himself into another on the other side, and said, "Now, my friend, plant yourself, as they say across the water. Help yourself to what there is as the spirit moves you, and talk. The more about yourself, the better. But stop, I forgot we do not even know each other's name yet. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Maurice Colston. I am a bachelor, as you see. For the rest, in practice, I am an idler, a dilettante, a good deal else that is pleasant and utterly useless. In theory, let me tell you, I am a socialist, or something of the sort, with a lively conviction as to the injustice and absurdity of the social and economic conditions which enable me to have such a good time on earth without having done anything to deserve it, beyond having managed to be born the son of my father." He stopped and looked at his guest through the wreaths of his cigar smoke, as much as to say, "And now who are you?" Arnold took the silent hint, and opened his mouth and his heart at the same time. Quite apart from the good turn he had done him, there was a genial frankness about his unconventional host that chimed in him so well with his own nature, that he cast all reserve aside, and told plainly and simply the story of his life and its master passion, his dreams and hopes and failures, and his final triumph in the hour when triumph itself was defeat. His host heard him through without a word, but towards the end of his story his face betrayed an interest, or rather an expectant anxiety to hear what was coming next, that no mere friendly concern of the moment for one less fortunate than himself could adequately account for. At length, when Arnold had completed his story with a brief but graphic description of the last successful trial of his model, he leant forward in his chair, and fixing his dark steady eyes on his guest's face, said in a voice from which every trace of his former good-humoured levity had vanished, "A strange story, and truer, I think, than the one I told you. Now tell me, on your honour as a gentleman, were you really in earnest when I heard you say on the embankment that you would rather smash up your model and take the secret with you into the next world than sell your discovery to the Tsar for the $1 million that he has offered for such an airship as yours?" "Absolutely in earnest," was the reply. "I've seen enough of the seamy side of this much-boasted civilization of ours to know that it is the most awful mockery that man has ever insulted his Maker with. It is based on fraud and sustained by force that ruthlessly crushes all who do not bow the knee to mammon. I am the enemy of a society that does not permit a man to be honest and live unless he has money and can defy it. I have just 2 shillings in the world, and I would rather throw them into the Thames and myself after them than take that $1 million from the Tsar in exchange for an engine of destruction that would make him master of the world." "Those are brave words," said Colston with a smile. "Forgive me for saying so, but I wonder whether you would repeat them if I told you that I am a servant of His Majesty the Tsar, and that you shall have that $1 million for your model and your secret the moment that you convince me that what you have told me is true." Before he had finished speaking, Arnold had risen to his feet. He heard him out, and then he said slowly and steadily, "I should not take the trouble to repeat them. I should only tell you that I am sorry that I have eaten salt with a man who could take advantage of my poverty to insult me. Good night." He was moving towards the door when Colston jumped up from his chair, strode round the table and got in front of him. Then he put his 2 hands on his shoulders, and, looking straight into his eyes, said in a tone that vibrated with emotion, "Thank God, I have found an honest man at last. Go and sit down again, my friend, my comrade, as I hope you soon will be. Forgive me for the foolishness that I spoke. I am no servant of the Tsar. He and all like him have no more devoted enemy on earth than I am. Look, I will soon prove it to you." As he said the last words, Colston let go Arnold's shoulders, flung off his coat and waistcoat, slipped his braces off his shoulders, and pulled his shirt up to his neck. Then he turned his bare back to his guest and said, "That is the sign manual of Russian tyranny, the mark of the knout." Arnold shrank back with a cry of horror at the sight. From waist to neck, Colston's back was a mass of hideous scars and wheals, crossing each other and rising up into purple lumps, with livid blue and grey spaces between them. As he stood, there was not an inch of naturally coloured skin to be seen. It was like the back of a man who had been flayed alive and then flogged with a cat-o'-nine-tails. Before Arnold had overcome his horror, his host had readjusted his clothing. Then he turned to him and said, "That was my reward for telling the governor of a petty Russian town that he was a brute beast for flogging a poor decrepit old Jewess to death. Do you believe me now when I say that I am no servant or friend of the Tsar?" "Yes, I do," replied Arnold, holding out his hand. "You were right to try me, and I was wrong to be so hasty. It is a failing of mine that has done me plenty of harm before now. I think I know now what you are without your telling me. Give me a piece of paper and you shall have my address, so that you can come tomorrow and see the model. Only I warn you that you will have to pay my rent to keep my landlord's hands off it. And then I must be off, for I see it's past 12. "You're not going out again tonight, my friend, while I have a sofa and plenty of rugs at your disposal," said his host. "You'll sleep here, and in the morning we'll go together to see this marvel of yours. Meanwhile, sit down and make yourself at home with another cigar. We have only just begun to know each other, we two enemies of society." End of chapter 2.